Well, welcome back to Classic Working Vehicles. We're back on the Unimog 421, the restoration project. Next job, start stripping the chassis. So taking off the exhaust system, fuel tank, battery box, air tank, all sorts of things need to come off the vehicle. So let's make a start. So I've already removed the power takeoff. Some of the shafts are in another building that I've taken off, and that all came off fairly straightforwardly. I had a bit of a fight with the banana box. This is the centralizing box for the power takeoff. This was really badly seized on at the top. So in the end, what I had to do, I forgot to film it, what I had to do is take this case apart so I could get at the gear inside and then put a puller onto that gear and pull it off the shaft, and that did the trick. I think it's only the bearings and things that have gone in here, and obviously seals. So I'm fairly optimistic this will work again after an overhaul. But on the vehicle itself, plenty still to remove, and I need to decide how far I want to go into the removal, whether we need to go down to a completely bare chassis or whether it's just a case of getting rid of all the ancillaries that are bolted to it, and then working with gearbox and transmission in place. We'll see as the task goes on. I want to remove the X-frame. This supports the rear body so it can tip 3 ways. But to be able to clean up the chassis and things properly, I need this to come off. It's held on at 4 points, bolt through each rear spring mount and 2 bolts through rubber bushes at the front, which allow it to twist and move a little bit and take out some of the vibration. I've already taken the bolts out of these. The problem you find with these is that the bush that's in here, metal elastic bush, corrosion gets in the steel sleeve and you can't get the central pin out. So there's a couple of things you can try. One is jacking out, which is what I'm going to try first, but usually it's seized. So what I've found in the past is I've had to cut through this part of the framework here with an angle grinder. Then hopefully I can push it out. It has to come out this way towards the camera. Then I can disassemble it more easily with this plate out of the way. We can always weld that, well, we will need to weld that back in later, but that's just the same construction it was done in the factory, so it'll be just as strong as it originally was. So the idea of the strap is just so I'm not holding the weight of the bottle jack. Bottle jacks aren't really designed to work on their side, but as long as the valve is at the lowest point, usually they will work. So we can use them as a press tool, really, to try and push out this bush. I've put a piece of steel, fairly heavy gauge box section along here just so the jack has got something that spreads the load to push against. And I'm going to use a socket to put that's smaller than the diameter of the hole that the bush is in. So see if we can push that through. I'm not optimistic it will push the bush out, but we'll have a go first. If it doesn't do that, we'll have to cut through this mount. Right, we'll try jacking and see whether it moves this bush at all. No, that's not budged. So I'm going to cut this mount and then have another go with the jack. So that's the outer mount off. We'll try jacking it again just in case it will move. If it doesn't, I'll drill around the bush. Okay, so it's pushed the bush out far enough, as you can see, that it's released the X-frame. So we might be able to get that off now. Well, that's the pin out. Still got to get the bush out of there, but that's the difficult bit. Done. So I've drilled around the rubber part of the bush. It's now moving quite a bit, so I'm hoping I can pull it out. There we go. That still leaves the outer sleeve of the bush. So I'll have to probably with a hacksaw, cut through that and then chisel it out. So this is one of the lift rams for the 3-point linkage. There's a pair of them that sit inside the rails, and where they're mounted, this sits snugly inside the chassis rail and is bolted through. Now the idea, if you were taking the hydraulic ram out, the cylinder, is that this pin needs to come out and it's threaded, so you can pull it out this way. It has a roll pin that goes through here. Here's one I've already removed, and that sits in that groove and stops the pin moving. Now the chances are these have not been out for over 50 years. Even getting the roll pin out was a struggle, to the extent that I managed to get the pins on the lift arm out, or the bell crank that lifts the arms, which allowed me to remove it, but I couldn't get this pin out with it in situ, and in fact in previous restorations I've never been able to when they're this sort of age. Now it would be tempting to try and hammer the pin that way, but there isn't clearance. This is cast, or there's a casting here that's welded onto this frame, and you can't drive that pin all the way out. So my technique is to measure up and then drill a fairly large hole on this side and then press out that pin. So that's what we're going to have a go at, just to show you best way to disassemble it. Why do we need to disassemble it? This all needs to be cleaned up and sandblasted. Cylinder may well need new seals and things fitted, so it needs to be apart to be able to do those jobs. So I've just measured from the other side and marked approximately where the centre of that pin is. So that's the hole I've just drilled. Now I can get at the back of that pin, put it in the press, and see if we can press it out that way. Let's hope so. So I've got a fairly large socket underneath, which the pin can drop into if it starts to move, and I'm using an old long reach socket to go through the hole I've drilled to push on the other end of the pin. This is a 12-ton press, so let's see if that's enough. Usually they go with a bit of a bang. It's pretty good. So the pins jumped out some of the way. I've still got a bit of depth left on there, so we'll give it another go. So I've run out of travel now, so I have to set things up a little bit differently to do the last bit of the press. There we go. But it's separated. So that's the pin, and you can see pretty corroded. Should have that recess going all the way around, like that one, which I've cleaned up. But this will clean up again, and I should be able to tap that thread, make that reusable, and by the time this is reassembled with grease and things, it should be all good to go once again. So before I think about removing the back axle or the torque tube to the back axle, it's worth testing whether the diff lock operates. In the 421, if it didn't have an air system, it had a hydraulically operated diff lock. It used all the same piping, but there would be a master cylinder up here for creating some hydraulic pressure to push the diff locks in the axles into place. If the Unimog had a compressed air system, it would have air-operated diff locks, again using the same pipework. The trouble with the air-operated ones is, like any compressed air system, it creates condensation, so you get moisture in there, and that leads to corrosion. So often, if a Unimog hasn't been used for a long time, with its diff locks can get seized. There's a dog clutch inside the axle tube that mesh and make it a rigid axle, essentially, giving you full diff lock. And there's one at the rear and there's one at the front. So before I take this apart, I want to test it. I've just cut off the pipe here because I'm going to have to replace it anyway. So I've got a compressed air line. I'm just going to put that in there as if this is the compressed air system on the Unimog to see whether that throws the diff lock in. I should be able to hear it click if it's doing it. So let's have a listen, see if it works. Okay, well, I heard the front one click. I don't know if you can pick that up. Yeah, but we have got, let me glove off, we've got quite a bit of air escaping through the axle breather. So this is the axle breather, and what's meant to happen is that the outer hub breathes through this bit of pipe, goes through the axle breather, and then that breathes up through the torque tube into the gearbox. So it makes it all watertight, but allows any difference in air pressure to escape through the top of the gearbox. This is either broken or being cut, and with the diff lock we're getting air pressure back out of here. And if that happens, it will compress the air inside the portal axle, inside the drop-down gearbox in the end of the portal axle, and it will push oil out past the oil seals and ultimately onto your brake linings and onto your brake drums, which is not good news. So there's a couple of ways you can do this. The cheap and cheerful way of solving this problem is to just run a separate breather back up, just a pipe, all the way back up to somewhere high on the gearbox, and allow it to breathe. As long as the compressor's keeping up with the diff lock, you know, it's a piston inside the cylinder, keeping up, that's a good way of getting it operating without it blowing the seals on the axles. But, you know, that's not a good fix. It's a kind of getting the Unimog back in business fix. Proper fix is to take this part of the axle tube, what's called the trumpet. You can unbolt the diff here, take that apart, and actually see if you can repair the piston. Well, actually, it's the cylinder usually that corrodes. that's inside. Sometimes you're lucky and you can hone it out and get it working again. So I'll have to investigate further. I didn't hear the rear one. They're mirrored each other. This is where the air goes in, this fairly large pipe here. There's a bleed screw on there that you can probably just see. If you're using the hydraulic system, that's where you bleed air out of the system when you're using it. It's redundant when it's the air system. I can't even hear it moving, the rear one. So we've either got a blockage in the pipe somewhere that feeds it, or it's just seized inside there. So I'll have to investigate further. But I've learned enough now that I can dismantle the pipe work. And I know the front one is working but leaking, and I suspect the rear one isn't working at all. But it's just a bit of quick diagnosis you can do before you take things apart any further. Next job, I'm going to unbolt the torque tube. That'll allow us to move it back slightly. I'll have to support the axle in some way and the chassis. And then I should be able to get in there and fold back the tabs that actually hold the drive for the rear prop shaft. I've already, in the process of taking the X-frame off, I've unbolted on the top of these suspension mounts, and what that also does is mean that these rear springs are now not attached anywhere under here. I need to undo this bar here that stops the axle moving horizontally. There's a bush it sits in down here, so I need to undo that. So then the rear axle is, once the torque tube is released, is independent of the chassis. But I'm going to have to make sure things are properly supported before I take it out, so nothing falls on me or falls over. The wheels I put temporarily back on the back axle, just so I can support it, but also so I could roll it back. You can see here now, created this gap. What I've got to do is fold back these little tabs on these bolts around here, undo that ring of bolts, there's 6 of them, and then I should be able to withdraw the rear axle. So there we are, all disassembled. Gearbox, engine, rear axle, front axle, and chassis. And overall, chassis looks to be in really good shape. There's no serious corrosion anywhere in it or on it. There's some repairs done around the suspension mount, but it's actually been done quite well. They are prone to cracking there. When I restored mine, it was cracked in the same position. But that's already been welded up. I need to weld these brackets back on. That's one of the next jobs I'm going to do. And then it'll be going off for media blasting, for sandblasting and priming. And in the meantime, I'll start to look at the axles, gearbox, and the engine in a bit more detail. Anyway, I hope you found it interesting. Until next time, see you. Boop, boop.